Today we're going to talk about an aphorism from Humanal to Human, Volume 2, which is also known as the Miscellaneous Maxims and Opinions. This is aphorism number 408, entitled The Journey to Hades. Quote, I too have been to the underworld, even as Odysseus, and I shall often be there again. Not sheep alone have I sacrificed, that I might be able to converse with a few dead souls, but not even my own blood have I spared. There were 4 pairs who responded to me in my sacrifice: Epicurus and Montaigne, Goethe and Spinoza, Plato and Rousseau, Pascal and Schopenhauer. With them I have come to terms. When I have long wandered alone, I will let them prove me right or wrong. To them will I listen when they prove each other right or wrong. In all that I say, conclude, or think out for myself and others, I fasten my eyes on those 8 and see their eyes fastened on mine. May the living forgive me if I look upon them at times as shadows, so pale and fretful, so restless, and alas, so eager for life. Those 8, on the other hand, seem to me so living that I feel as if even now, after their death, they could never become weary of life. But eternal liveliness is the important point. What does eternal life, or indeed life at all, matter to us? End quote. This is not the most famous passage in Nietzsche's canon, but it is one of the most important. It's a passage that all serious Nietzscheans eventually come across, and it's a beautiful example of Nietzschean prose, in my opinion. Even at a cursory glance, we get the sense that there is something profound in it, in the way that Nietzsche calls these great thinkers, all of whom are dead, more alive, livelier than the average living person around him. This passage expresses that Nietzschean sentiment that some lives are like world historical events, that some lives become so powerful as to become eternally lively, which is really nothing like the Christian desire for eternal life, which would be something like being itself in the abstract, preserved forever. Rather, these 8 are each a form of life, an embodied possibility for life, the voice for that certain possibility of life, a way of living that is somehow still a source of vitality for the philosopher today who draws upon it, a way of living that expresses a greater value than all the carbon copy lives that characterize the great majority of the human experience. In examining this passage, Journey to Hades, one might draw a parallel to Machiavelli here, and what he says in his letter to Vittori about his daily routine while living in exile in the Italian countryside. This is the way that Machiavelli describes his daily reading of the writers and poets of classical antiquity. Quote, When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine, and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me, and for 4 hours at a time, I feel no boredom. I forget all my troubles. I do not dread poverty, and I am not terrified by death. I absorb myself into them completely. End quote. Machiavelli's communion with the ancients is not something that he experiences as merely reading their words, but as questioning them, conversing with them, hearing their voices. Likewise, Nietzsche says that he fastens his eyes on these 8 figures, all dead, seemingly no more than spirits or memories, just as with Machiavelli's ancients. And yet, they fasten their eyes back at Nietzsche, just as he fastens his eyes on them. He allows himself to accept judgment from them, to be proved right or wrong by them, and to verify his own judgments by comparing it with theirs. There's a real sense of communication, as if these figures are so lively and that this vitality somehow imbues their writing that you're actually meeting with these past figures. We might also compare Nietzsche's aphorism to the words of one of these 8 figures, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who writes in the preface to his discourse on inequality, that as he gives his arguments in that discourse, quote, I shall imagine myself in the Lyceum of Athens, repeating the lessons of my masters, having a Plato or Xenocrates for my judges, and the human race for my audience. End quote. And so Nietzsche therefore speaks to something in this passage that characterizes the experience of many philosophers and writers, tracing all the way back to Thucydides, who says that he writes for posterity and not for the whims of his current age. Nietzsche's companions in the underworld, Rousseau's judges, Machiavelli's venerable ancients, these are the audience for which the true philosopher writes. But all that I've said so far is only the broadest possible interpretation of this passage, because there are 8 specific figures here, and Nietzsche lists them in pairs. And it is this structure that can be perplexing, especially upon first encountering this passage, because the passage Journey to Hades therefore demands at least 2 levels of interpretation. On the one hand, one has to consider the relevance of each of these 8 figures to Nietzsche's thought to understand what he means here. Their one-to-one relation to him, how he would have seen each of them, how he would have characterized the possibility for life that each one of them represents, and why he includes them as being these figures of such great importance. And on the other hand, in order to really understand the full passage, there's the second level of interpretation. What is the significance of pairing these figures, as Nietzsche has done? How does each pair relate to one another? And do all the pairs have anything in common? These are the sort of questions that one might ask. And therefore, the first impulse that many of us might have might be to apply a certain formula to each of these pairs. For example, perhaps one thinker in each pair is Dionysian and the other is an Apollinian. Or maybe one thinker in each pair is a yes-saying individual and the other is a no-saying individual. Maybe in each pair there's one who is an influence on Nietzsche, whereas the other is an adversary. Unfortunately, none of those possible formulae work, in my opinion. When we try to apply one of these rules, there's always some exception to it that wrecks the whole thing. For example, in Pascal and Schopenhauer, we have 2 no-saying individuals, in Nietzsche's understanding of them, anyway. And in another pair, Goethe and Spinoza, 2 yes-saying individuals. In Epicurus and Montaigne, we have 2 figures Nietzsche mostly wrote positively about, and in Plato and Rousseau, we have 2 figures he mostly wrote negatively about. Trying to apply the Apollinian and Dionysian formula similarly fails, since it's hard to imagine either Pascal or Schopenhauer as Dionysian, or either Epicurus or Montaigne as Dionysian, for that matter. And so, in light of these considerations, it doesn't seem justified to say that Nietzsche is placing these figures into a neat categorization scheme. Instead, the interpretive approach that I would advocate involves treating each pair as a unique comparison, a unique contrast, each of which signifies some fundamental similarity between the 2 and some fundamental difference. And it's only in the light of each specific contrast, each specific difference, that something is revealed about the underlying possibility for life that both figures represent. And so it's by pairing them, by holding them up beside one another for comparison, that we see them in their individuality all the more clearly. Something else you may have noticed about this passage is who isn't mentioned. Heraclitus, Voltaire, Kant, Emerson, Socrates, and many others, figures who have great influence on Nietzsche's thought, some of whom are mentioned many more times in his work than any of these, nevertheless don't figure into this particular aphorism for whatever reason. The 8 given in The Journey to Hades, therefore, shouldn't be taken as the definitive list of all the important influences on Nietzsche's thought. There are undoubtedly others. What we can say, however, is that at the very particular time in Nietzsche's life when this passage is written, Nietzsche felt a special sense of indebtedness and kinship with these 8 philosophical and artistic minds. Those books that we now know as volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Human All Too Human began as scribblings in Nietzsche's notebooks in the years 1875 through 1879. Those were the latter days of Nietzsche's university career, and Nietzsche starts writing in earnest after his retreat from the Bayreuth Festival in 1876, where he went off to that small town near the woods. And by this time, Nietzsche, who was still a professor in the philology department, had repeatedly expressed an interest in switching his focus to philosophy, an idea that the university had pushed back against. It was also a period of worsening health for Nietzsche that culminated in his early retirement from the university by the end of the 1870s. But as Nietzsche later says of this period, the last years of the 1870s, he writes in Ecce Homo that every single word in Human All Too Human was a little victory, another step in his long journey towards freedom, emancipating himself from his past prejudices. And so this is the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophizing. These years are the time in which Nietzsche's middle period begins, in which he definitively departs from philological writing and from cultural criticism, and begins to philosophize in earnest. And it's at this point where he truly becomes who he is, a philosopher. And in the heart of that work, Nietzsche pens this aphorism where he pays tribute to these 8. And so I would argue that their significance is that they should all be counted as formative in Nietzsche's philosophical thought, even if there are other very important influences. We have discussed all of these figures and their relationship to Nietzsche in their own past episodes. For the rest of today's talk, we're going to revisit each of these figures and consider them in light of the pairing that Nietzsche has placed them in. And hopefully at the end of that process, we'll have a sense for the significance of the full meaning of this passage, Journey to Hades. This passage epitomizes how so much of Nietzsche's writing can only be fully appreciated in light of the thinkers that he's responding to. Now, this is not true of every passage in Nietzsche. Many of his thoughts are perfectly comprehensible upon a completely naive reading of his work. But it is plainly true here. You won't get anything out of this passage if you are unfamiliar with these 8. So without further ado, we'll begin with Epicurus and Montaigne. Epicurus is the great negative hedonist of Hellenistic Greece, the period after Alexander. He lives from 341 to 270 BC. The central principle of Epicurean philosophy is the principle that happiness is found by the reduction of pain, the reduction of suffering and distress in all its forms. Epicurus argues, quote, "The removal of all feeling of pain is the limit of the magnitude of pleasures." End quote. So the limit on our happiness is the amount of pain or discomfort that we experience. And the more these negative feelings are removed, the happier we are. Unlike a positive hedonist who believes in expanding the scope of our pleasures, Epicurus is solely focused on reducing pain, setting as his goal the serene life, which is minimally involved with suffering. Epicurus states in his 31st maxim, quote, "He who has learned the limits of life knows that it is easy to provide that which removes the feeling of pain owing to want, and to make one's whole life perfect. So there is no need for things which involve struggle." End quote. Accordingly, Epicurus and his followers lived austere lives, set apart from the arenas of competition, ambition, political machinations that characterized ancient Greece. All such entanglements create a form of mental suffering, in the form of fear, the worry for losing one's position of power, or worrying that by defeating one's enemy in the here and now, you'll create resentment that will come back to bite you tomorrow. The Epicurean ideal, in contrast to this, is the quiet garden, perhaps a commune of a few like-minded souls, good friends who require little for their happiness, little other than the basic human needs such as sustenance and good company. The Epicurean ideal is to live in withdrawal from personal drama, withdrawn from the duties and obligations toward the polis, withdrawn from allegiance to a political party. The ideal, in short, is simplicity. As Maxim 14 says, quote, The purest security is that which comes from a quiet life and withdrawal from the many." End quote. Epicurus was a materialist and, in some sense, the inheritor of the project of Democritus, who was his main philosophical influence. So we could be thankful that Plato didn't succeed in burning all of Democritus's treatises, and some came into the hands of Epicurus. He was a grammar teacher at the time, and the treatises of Democritus awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. He was primarily intrigued by the Democritean notion of explaining physical reality and all of the various phenomena within it, all the motion of the matter in the universe, with physical means, mechanistic means. The materialistic, mathematized atomism of the Democriteans is inseparable from the Epicurean worldview. The Epicurean worldview is a kind of ethical development upon that philosophy, and it doesn't really make any sense without it. Because if the Democriteans are correct, and this is the kind of universe that we inhabit, an atomized one, which is not determined by the dictates or whims of gods or spirits, but by physical laws, then one could indeed make the argument, as Epicurus does, that our only ethical concerns are pain and pleasure. Whatever sense experience we shall have, while constituted as living beings in a material realm, that's what ought to concern us. Without an afterlife or a higher purpose to existence, the only concern is this material reality, which we only know through our sense experience. And so accordingly, Epicurus preached to his followers, quote, "Death is nothing to us, for what has been dissolved has no sense experience, and what has no sense experience is nothing to us." End quote. This materialistic comfort in the finitude of life was one of the most influential aspects of Epicureanism, and it was carried forward into the time of the ancient Romans. Epicureanism became a very prominent religious or philosophical orientation, especially among Roman aristocrats. This led to the common practice among the Epicurean Romans of marking their gravestones with the saying, quote, "I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care." End quote. Nietzsche was fascinated by Epicurus because of what he represented. Epicureanism is like a form of Greek Buddhism for those Romans, who they're no longer faithful to the old pagan religions, but they still live prior to the arrival of Christianity in this new religious turn in Europe. Deleuze argues for this reason that Epicurus, like the Buddha, is a preacher of a kind of nihilism, an approach to life which promotes non-struggle, the reduction of one's suffering by desiring for less, teaching men to be satisfied with less, to find satisfaction in forms of pleasure which don't cause us pain later, fresh air, exercise, sunshine, companionship, a healthy meal, a good night's sleep. In the case of Buddhism, their practice of jhana, everything is geared towards freeing the mind from worry and discontent. And it's on that same basis as the Buddhists that the Epicurean finds liberation in their detachment from strife and struggling, living an almost ascetic lifestyle. And importantly, another similarity to Buddhism is that Epicurus, unlike the Christians, who would eventually inherit the Greek world in the coming centuries, Epicurus doesn't condemn the world as inherently sinful or flawed. A happy life, a good life, is possible. If one follows the Epicurean ethical model, happiness is the result. That is the promise of Epicureanism. The model is essentially an abdication of striving, and once you get rid of those limits to your happiness, the suffering that you cause yourself unnecessarily, you can indeed be happy with very little. And Nietzsche's assertion is, fundamentally, that this was the correct thing for the Romans at this particular period of time. Their pagan society had lost faith in itself. It's entering this period of decline, and so Epicurus, like Buddha, comes along to teach them how to die well, how to confront that decline with serenity. In some way, we might say, he teaches them to go quiet into that good night. This is why Nietzsche writes in Daybreak, aphorism 72, entitled The Life After Death, quote, "Christianity found the idea of punishment and hell in the entire Roman Empire. for the numerous mystic cults have hatched this idea with particular satisfaction as being the most fecund egg of their power. Epicurus thought he could do nothing better for his followers than to tear this belief up by the roots. His triumph found its finest echo in the mouth of one of his disciples, the Roman Lucretius, a poet of a gloomy, though afterwards enlightened, temperament. Alas, his triumph had come too soon. Christianity took under its special protection this belief in subterranean horrors, which was already beginning to die away in the minds of men. End quote. So, one of Nietzsche's arguments about the ancient world is that final death was once seen as the worst possible fate, and that during the time of, say, St. Paul, or the time leading up to St. Paul, immortality was seen even by people such as the Jews as something given only to the very few. And that in the pagan world, the examples of what Nietzsche calls subterranean horrors here, the idea of eternal torment or eternal punishment of the soul, these existed in these subterranean cults, as he calls them, cults like the Pythagoreans, for example, and that this whole belief system was something that was pseudo-pagan and was dying away in the minds of men before Christianity came about, that there was actually a prefiguration for the idea of eternal punishment in these pre-Christian pagan cults. And Epicurus attempted to uproot precisely this belief in the immortality of the soul for that very purpose. That's the target of his philosophy. Because attacking this belief, destroying that belief, will have a positive benefit from the Epicurean perspective upon our happiness now. There's nothing better for your happiness in the here and now than to fully embrace that this life is finite and there's no need to worry about your fate after death. That Epicurus comes to teach human beings that non-existence is not a form of suffering. It is the liberation from all suffering. And nowadays, that same attitude could potentially be achieved by scientific materialism. That's what Nietzsche calls the triumph of Epicurus. In another passage, he writes that, quote, Epicurus is once more triumphant, end quote, in the ascendance of this kind of worldview. Nietzsche echoes those comments in Antichrist number 59, quote, one has but to read Lucretius to know what Epicurus made war upon, not paganism, but Christianity, which is to say the corruption of souls by means of the concepts of guilt, punishment, and immortality. He combated the subterranean cults, the whole of latent Christianity. To deny immortality was already a form of genuine salvation. Epicurus had triumphed, and every respectable intellect in Rome was Epicurean, when Paul appeared. Paul, the Chandala hatred of Rome, of the world. End quote. Now, let us consider Michel de Montaigne, who lived during the Renaissance from 1533 to 1592 in France. He knew Latin from a young age. His father insisted in an education on the classics. Montaigne was from a family of minor nobles, and as such he was expected to attend law school, to take a post within the provincial government, all as part of his family's tradition of civil service. When he was in his 30s, Montaigne began to write down his thoughts. He wrote of his life experience, of his observations about people, his opinions, and his memories, and he did so with candor and without any scholarly pretensions. And as such, we know Montaigne in modern times as the man who invented the literary form of the essay. Montaigne also traveled throughout the Europe of the 1500s as well, and he also leaves behind a series of travelogues. In terms of his ideas, Montaigne could be classified as a Pyrrhonist. That is to say, he identifies with the philosophical school of antiquity known as the Skeptics. Montaigne called his mind, quote, wavering and diverse, end quote. And he lived by the motto, quote, I determine nothing, I do not comprehend things, I suspend judgment, I examine, end quote. He wrote in one of his essays, quote, the profession of Pyrrhonists is to waver, doubt, and inquire, to be sure of nothing, to answer for nothing, end quote. Montaigne was, fundamentally, a critic of rationalism. He believed that the Enlightenment zeitgeist had paid a kind of reverence to human reason that was undue and foolish, and this was reflected in the theological debates of the time, now that there were those who believed that Scripture could be proven by scientific inquiry or proven by logical argumentation. And the ongoing argument between these and the more traditional defenders of the faith who believed that faith was required, that one had ultimately to believe in the Word of God and the salvation of Christ. Trusting in the human intellect to get there all on its own is something ill-advised from that standpoint. And Montaigne would have agreed with the critics of rationalism on that last point. In Montaigne's work, we don't find a Pascaline advocacy for blind faith. Rather, Montaigne argues in favor of using reason to defend and uphold Christianity, but then simultaneously argues that in so doing, we will see the impotence of human reason. What upholds Montaigne's own faith is not belief per se, but prudence. Montaigne is therefore a strange breed of skeptic, seen from the modern perspective. He does not criticize Christians for putting forward beliefs for which they have no evidence, which might be the modus operandi of skeptics today, but rather he criticizes the atheists and agnostics for trusting in their own reason too much in their critiques of religion. He quotes Lucretius, who writes, quote, "Whoever thinks that we know nothing does not know whether we know enough to say that this is so." End quote. Montaigne, for his part, sides with the Catholics over the Protestant reformers, and he argues it's a good thing to follow in the traditions set down by one's forefathers. But he's not a firebrand for the Catholic Church either. He doesn't take a strong stance on what is or isn't to be considered a heresy. He argues instead, quote, "It is setting a high value on our opinions to roast people alive on account of them." End quote. In terms of his personal character, one of his closest friends said of Montaigne that he was equal parts vice and virtue, that he was equally cool-headed and reflective and filled with burning passion. Montaigne described himself with the following adjectives, quote, "bashful, insolent, chaste, lustful, prating, silent, laborious, delicate, ingenious, heavy, melancholic, pleasant, lying, true, knowing, ignorant, liberal, covetous, and prodigal." End quote. The picture we therefore get of Montaigne, in his own words, is a figure who is contradictory, flawed, and very human. He is a flawed man who is many things at once. He is a husband, a father, a noble, a traveler, a skeptic, a Catholic. When Montaigne dies, he receives the last rites from a priest as though he were any other staunchly believing Catholic. All of his doubting was, after all, the exercise of his reason, which never leads us to absolute certainty. And so, again, Montaigne lives in a kind of prudent faith. It's really the only option of a man who possesses the knowledge of the impotence of reason. In his works, we don't find any consistent ethical prescriptions beyond piecemeal practical advice, all of which is based on his personal experience. Montaigne doesn't believe, in other words, that he has found the proper way to live. He does not advance an ethical system, and he does not have the pretense of saying that you ought to live by his instruction. One of the mantras of Montaigne that he always asks himself, that he always brings to his mind is, quote, "What do I know?" End quote. So what is the significance of Nietzsche's pairing of Epicurus and Montaigne? At first glance, there's something very similar about them. Both, in one way or another, emphasize prudence. They write with a very different tenor than the one that Nietzsche usually sounds, to live dangerously and build your temples on the slopes of Vesuvius. Instead, Epicurus says, retreat to the secluded garden. But Montaigne, who is involved with public life, does so out of this sort of prudent philosophy of going along with his circumstances, fulfilling the duties and obligations of his station in life, out of a skepticism, a suspicion towards his own human reason that might want to criticize those duties and obligations, try and undermine or find flaws in them in perhaps a Socratic manner. Montaigne's skepticism is very different. So, for example, he accepts a position of power as mayor, but it is only upon the insistence of the monarch of France. Montaigne, in fact, complained of, quote, the slavery of the court and of public duties, end quote. All of these duties which he felt obligated to fulfill, and did fulfill. And right here, we see that potential insight into understanding these two men, in this essential difference between them. Montaigne does not exit from public life, in spite of his own inclinations. He's not exactly a Cesare Borgia. It's not as if Epicurus and Montaigne are opposites. It's not a vulgar contrast of that sort. And by the way, none of these contrasts are going to be vulgar contrasts that are just simply to say, oh, they're the opposite of one another. It's something much more subtle. Montaigne does not live a life of Machiavellian power struggles. Just like the Epicureans, he has no desire for such things. And yet, Montaigne is even too skeptical to reject public life on the basis of the kind of ethical considerations that an Epicurean might make. And perhaps the best way of bringing out this subtle contrast is in the fact that Montaigne marries and has children, but that one gets the sense from reading him that this was perhaps yet another one of those obligations. He says, for example, that he wills himself into falling in love with his wife, that naturally he has to continue the family line. He has to ensure the future of his family's estate. And this is interesting to consider in light of Nietzsche's comments in Daybreak number 150, entitled The Hazard of Marriages. Quote, nothing can in the end result from humanity. Individuals are wasted, for all rationality of a great advance of humanity is rendered impossible by the hazard of marriages. Let us cease from being the assiduous spectators and fools of this aimless drama. It was in this mood that the gods of Epicurus withdrew long ago to their divine seclusion and felicity. They were tired of men and their love affairs. End quote. So, Epicurus says to withdraw even from things like marriage. Remove that potential source of tension or malcontent from your life. The ethical conviction of the Epicureans is that it is best to live like a monk, eating only simple food, maybe some wine for your digestion, maybe some figs and cheese as the most extravagant luxury that you permit yourself. That's all you need out of life. You don't need to procreate or find your soulmate. You don't need to establish a lineage or worry about preserving your estate. That kind of thing is a desire that causes more suffering than it's worth. But Montaigne is willing to get entangled with the hazards of marriage, because one ought to obey one's country's laws and its traditions and the social mores. One ought to follow in the traditions of one's fathers and forefathers. Because the alternative is for Montaigne to put a great stock in the estimation of his own reason, which he's not willing to do. And so that great difference is revealed in this ethical conviction of Epicurus, the ethical conviction of his negative hedonism. He comes to the conclusion that one can make certain rational statements about the best way to live. One can have a rational understanding of how to find happiness. Happiness is best served by the rational knowledge that vengeful gods in the afterlife don't exist. And perhaps the most interesting thing about that is that Epicurus even counsels the wise Epicurean, make all the proper sacrifices to the gods, pay them the proper respects, and behave morally, behave piously, so that just in case these things do exist and we're completely wrong, you'll have all your bases covered, just in case there is an afterlife. This advice in itself is a form of rational consideration. It is hedging your bets. It's quite different from Montaigne's faith, which is a sort of reverse, an admission of logic's impotence, even though logic might be able to pick all sorts of holes in faith, and thus the implicit acceptance that one must live in a kind of prudent religiosity in spite of one's skepticism. That's what characterizes the spirituality of Montaigne. And so in this first pairing, there is an uncanny similarity in terms of the temperament of these respective figures, perhaps as sort of a satisfaction with a life outside of or withdrawn from ambition or struggle or the contestation between differing views. But in Epicurus, we find a materialist and an ethicist, ultimately a rational figure, who arrives, therefore, at a kind of European Buddhism by way of rational conviction. Whereas in Montaigne, we find the total skeptic, who arrives at Christianity by way of intellectual humility. Epicurus is the man of reason, who uses reason to overcome all of those dubious religious superstitions, and he's even reasonable enough as to recommend hedging your bets by respecting those traditions. And ultimately, this man of reason, Epicurus, finds his salvation in this purely materialistic ethical worldview. Montaigne, on the other hand, is the man of doubt, who doubts so much that he even doubts reason. He doubts agnosticism, which we might think of as a philosophy of doubt. He throws himself into Christianity, but he does it with a wink and a smile. Even though Nietzsche found Epicurus to be an admirable figure, the creator of a, quote, heroic, idyllic way to philosophize, end quote, Montaigne is probably the closer figure to Nietzsche's heart. He's the definitive Renaissance man in many ways. We might look to Nietzsche's words from the Antichrist, quote, the European of today, in his essential worth, falls far below the European of the Renaissance, end quote. And Michel de Montaigne is the model of that Renaissance European. He's the worldly man who experiments, he innovates a new style of literature, and he entangles himself in the world. He's the man of tradition and virtue, but he's also thoroughly modern. Modern in the way that he questions and doubts, exercises his reason, compares and contrasts. Epicurus is that shepherd for those at the end of a great civilization, whereas Montaigne is a model citizen at the beginning of a new one. Goethe and Spinoza. The contrast of Goethe and Spinoza probably requires less explanation than any of the others on this list, because the connection between the two is rather well known. Spinoza was an influence on the thought of Goethe. In fact, he may be the definitive influence, the definitive philosophical influence anyway, on the worldview of that great romantic playwright. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe lived from 1749 to 1832. He is one of the most prolific writers in the German language and the definitive German cultural figure of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Striving, ambition, and internal drive to continue creating, producing, conquering, and so on, this sort of orientation to the world that would seem foreign to both Epicurus and Montaigne. This is Goethe's defining feature in some sense. He writes hundreds of poems. He writes the definitive Sturm und Drang novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, a work that would have become the favorite of figures such as Napoleon. He writes the celebrated play Faust. He writes the definitive autobiography in the German language, Dichtung und Wahrheit. And the record of Goethe's conversations that was taken down by Eckermann is called, quote, the best German book there is, end quote, by Nietzsche himself. Goethe also directs a theater. He comes up with a scientific theory on the nature of color. He studies botany. He creates his own neo-Kantian approach to botanical theory. So Goethe strives to accomplish great things in so many different domains of art and of thought. In his play, Faust, the main character is a reflection of that same irrational drive to productivity. He is gripped by the desire to know all things, to experience all things. He has the desire for all the knowledge and pleasure in the world. And he has the belief that true happiness, true lasting contentment, is impossible. For Goethe, happiness is only found in movement, and happiness is never found in the moment of a task's completion. It is only ever found as one sets their sights to the next task. This spirit of striving is immortalized in the opening monologue of Faust, wherein the titular character, Dr. Heinrich Faust, says, quote, "I have, alas, studied philosophy, jurisprudence and medicine too, and worst of all theology, with keen endeavor through and through. And here I am, for all my lore, the wretched fool I was before, called Master of Arts and Doctor to boot. For 10 years almost I confute, and up and down wherever it goes, I drag my students by the nose, and see that for all our science and art, we can know nothing. It burns my heart." End quote. So after mastering all 4 of the faculties of the German university, Dr. Faust finds not satisfaction, but more yearning for something beyond all of this book learning. He turns to magic. He says he wishes to, quote, "envisage the creative blazes instead of rummaging in phrases," end quote. Eventually, Faust is visited by Mephistopheles. The two strike a wager that Mephistopheles will give Faust all the worldly things he could ever desire, but if Faust should ever say, quote, "Abide moment, thou art so fair," end quote. In other words, if Faust should ever express contentment, if he should ever wish for the moment to linger, then Mephistopheles will win Faust's soul. And Faust agrees to this wager because he believes that such a moment of lasting happiness is impossible. The entire Faust play is structured around this wager. We follow Faust's trials and tribulations as he journeys with Mephisto through Germany and then back in time to Hellenic Greece. He experiences the witches' Sabbath. He has his life unnaturally extended by sorcery. Faust finds love, loses love, ruins lives. He has a whole series of adventures. And at the end, in spite of the fact that Faust does eventually find happiness in a single moment that he wishes to last, God still commands that Faust be saved. He cancels the terms of the wager. The angels come to take Faust up to heaven just at the moment when Mephisto was about to drag his soul down to hell, and the angels declare as they do so that anyone who strives with all their might, they are allowed to save. Goethe said to Eckermann that his whole life had been a toil and a never-ending series of obligations and struggles. That the price of celebrity, the acquisition of the means to do great things, was a public life, public duties, the demands of high society that often distracted Goethe from his poetic work. Even though he spent his entire life working on Faust, he warned the young Eckermann against embarking on a great work of his own because of all the time that Goethe felt he had lost for writing occasional poems. His day-to-day poetic output suffered. Goethe feels that he never has enough time. He has all these self-imposed responsibilities because he is irrationally driven to his great task, this artistic calling, something that in past ages would have been seen as the work of the Muses. This calling drives Goethe to become one of the most prolific German writers and the greatest German playwright. Faust is a reflection of Goethe. The moral of the Faust play is that this great spirit of striving ought to be redeemed, in spite of what the Christian moral valuations have taught us about humility and eschewing worldly ambition and so on. Nietzsche said of Goethe that this was his great value as a type. He was powerfully creative and productive, even into his final years. Nietzsche writes, for example, in Use and Abuse of History for Life, quote, "Someone has lately tried to tell us that Goethe has outlived himself with his 82 years, and yet I would gladly take 2 of Goethe's outlived years in exchange for whole cartloads of fresh, modern lifetimes, to have another set of such conversations as those with Eckermann, and be preserved from all the modern talk of these esquires of the moment." End quote. Goethe is often categorized among the Romantics. As for why, we might look to Goethe's view of poetry. Goethe's view is that one ought to write about what is given by immediate experience. Rather than contriving a meaning behind his poems, he suggests simply express the imagery and feelings within your experience and the raw, immediate moment of those feelings. Goethe is also a Hellenist, an enthusiast for the culture of the ancient Greeks, for their art, their poetry, their philosophy. The metrical style of the Greek tragedies is figuratively resurrected in his Faust play, and the scene in which Helen of Troy is brought from the past into the Germany of Dr. Faust, the Europe of Christendom, Europe at the beginning of the early modern period. Helen speaks in Greek hexameters in non-rhyming verse, which is the style of the Greek epics, but she steadily adopts the rhyming iambic verses of modern poetry, as the more she's exposed to the modern world. And so Goethe wished to be a kind of bridge between the naive, sentimental, natural absorption of the ancient Greeks and post-Enlightenment Europe that had, gone through these the scientific revolutions and rationalism and so on and so forth. That's what we see in this passage, that bringing Helen of Troy into modern-day Europe and having her then speak in the language of modern-day Europe. And so this is why Goethe is classed among the Romantics. He's seen as part of the reaction to rationalism and part of that tendency in European thought, particularly in Germany at that time, to then reach back to earlier time periods for inspiration. Baruch Spinoza, on the other hand, would seem like the opposite type in so many respects. In some sense, many would say that he's responsible for the zeitgeist of rationalism. Spinoza lives 2 centuries earlier, from 1632 to 1677. Unlike Goethe, he was not a man of high society. He was born at the margins of society as a Sephardic Jew. He lived among their insular community within Amsterdam. In his education, he became influenced by the philosophy of figures such as Giordano Bruno, Maimonides, and others. Spinoza came to doubt the literal truth of Scripture. He came to wonder about the nature of God. For this, once it was discovered, the rabbis and the broader Jewish community excommunicated him and cast him out from the faith and from their community. Spinoza lived as a man without a people for the rest of his life, and nevertheless rose to become one of the most important figures of Western philosophy. Unlike Goethe, who lived a long, full life in the spotlight of celebrity, productive in every field imaginable, Spinoza lived a short, obscure life in relative poverty, perhaps shortened by breathing in glass particles while grinding lenses for a living, and he focuses on one major domain of striving: philosophy. Spinoza believed that all nature was synonymous with God, that all apparently individual and separate phenomena were in fact modifications of the same fundamental substance, which is God. God is the unconditioned whole, of which every individual conditioned thing is dependent. God and nature are one. Spinoza writes, quote, "God is not in any one place, but is everywhere according to his essence." End quote. Spinoza argues that all phenomena have both a material and a spiritual aspect, that therefore everything can be conceived of in these 2 different attributes, both as an extended body in space and as a concept. One might say that we could think of any phenomenon in terms of its outward form or its underlying substance. Spinoza is classed as a pantheist, someone who believes that God is coterminous with all the universe and all the things in it. All are a part of God. God is not separate from his creation. But rather than a personal God, Spinoza's God is what we might call supra-personal. The will of God, which is eternal and unchanging, is to be understood as those laws of nature which apprehend at all times and in all places. Spinoza writes that God, quote, does not act from freedom of will, end quote, but out of necessity. And therefore, we might say that the dictates of God might be synonymous with the laws of physics. Spinoza's peculiar form of spirituality, of reverence for the natural world, as a form of worship of the divine, has therefore been influential on scientists throughout history, most notably Einstein, who, when asked whether he believed in God, said he believed in the God of Spinoza. In spite of his excommunication, Spinoza lived a relatively peaceful life. He did write a political treatise which advocated for secular governance, which got him denounced and called demonic, but Spinoza was not really a revolutionary. His Ethics, which is his magnum opus, puts forward the viewpoint that man's will is not free, for all is determined. Nothing can act at variance with the will of God, and God does not act from freedom of will himself, but according to rigorous necessity. One should therefore detach themselves from the sad passions, fear and hope. Spinoza believed that being enthralled to these feelings was the cause of human unfreedom. That freedom is not freedom of the will in the libertarian sense, of being the arbitrary master of one's own fate, but freedom is freedom from these sad passions. Quote, human infirmity in moderating and checking the emotions I name bondage. For when a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master, but lies at the mercy of fortune. End quote. Spinoza asserted that one can, through a deterministic understanding, forgive all trespasses, achieving an ironically rather Christian viewpoint and a Christian orientation towards one's fellow man. All is fated, and thus all is forgiven. Spinoza was said by all who knew him to be a humble, charming man who enchanted everyone who knew him. He bore not an ounce of resentment toward those who had cast him out, because he regarded everyone who did him harm as a sort of fatality. He regarded the political and religious fanatics who threatened his life and posed a real danger to him as being of no more fault, morally, than a natural disaster or a predator in the animal kingdom. So what is the significance of Nietzsche's pairing of Goethe and Spinoza? Well, the kinship between the two is plainly obvious when we consider the influence of Spinoza on Goethe's thought. Eckermann writes of this in his book on Goethe. Quote, since the great being that we call the Godhead manifests itself not just in humans, but also in an abundant and powerful nature, and in mighty world events, any conception of it formed by analogy with human characteristics is bound to be inadequate, and the attentive observer will soon stumble across shortcomings and contradictions that will plunge him into doubt, if not despair. Unless, that is, he is either small enough to be satisfied with some specious evasion, or big enough to look at things from a higher perspective. Goethe found such a perspective early on in Spinoza, and he joyfully acknowledges how closely the views of this great thinker accorded with the needs of his youth. He saw himself reflected in him, and so was able to refine and develop his own thinking by reading him. End quote. As part of Goethe's Hellenist project, he was searching for a way to reconnect with the majesty of nature, but the natural world had increasingly become demystified, disenchanted by the increasingly mechanistic understanding put forward by the scientific Enlightenment. From Goethe's point of view, Spinoza's God is a wonderful sublation of this deterministic understanding of the world. We reorient our view of the natural world into a reverent awe for the divine. We reinterpret this mechanistic understanding as the unchallengeable will of God. Spinoza's view of nature, his view of God, is deterministic, but he does not attempt to reduce everything down to the material, to make God just nature, as one might say. But rather, Spinoza would say, this world that you see as merely natural is in fact the domain of the most holy. His task is to elevate the natural world up to the divine. He's not trying to drag the divine down. Goethe's return to the naive, the sentimental worship of nature finds its justification in Spinoza in this way. The pantheistic view is Goethe's way of redeeming the romantic, poetic possibility for life while remaining still within the scientific understanding of the world explained by predictable laws of the most rigorous necessity. We've done away with miracles and ex nihilo creation events and the will of we might say the arbitrary whims of a personal deity, and yet we can still have that reverence for the divine. But in this kinship between these two great minds, the world of difference between them also comes into clear perception. Spinoza is not a romantic. He's not a poet. He's not even an artist. His thought is ruled by that same rigorous necessity, and his arguments are proven geometrically. He sees the only legitimate philosophy as philosophy governed by a properly mathematized logic, and his eye is fixed on the underlying substance rather than the outward form. Goethe and Spinoza are like night and day on that particular aspect, for Goethe is absolutely focused on the outward form as a poet. Furthermore, Spinoza's strict adherence to logic could not set him further apart from Goethe when it comes to style. It is difficult to imagine Spinoza writing a novel at all, much less something like The Sorrows of Young Werther. And when I said earlier that Montaigne was entangled in the world with Goethe, that would be an understatement. And when it comes to love affairs, Goethe is just as prolific in this respect as he is with his poetry. Spinoza, on the other hand, is a hermit, a recluse, a sickly man who dies in middle age. He retreats from Amsterdam because, he says, the social demands on his time were getting in the way of writing philosophy. Spinoza would choose more time for philosophy over the social life any day of the week. Goethe, on the other hand, spends much of his long life within high society. He's the opposite of an outcast. He possesses fame and fortune, and he was recognized everywhere he went. And yet, he's the kind of man who feels that he never has any time because he does choose to balance the social life with his productive career, and he often regrets or laments this fact. Nietzsche calls both of these figures his predecessors in one of his explanatory notes for Zarathustra. But when it comes to determining which one Nietzsche feels closer to, it is difficult to say. In later Nietzsche, he treats Goethe as a model of his Dionysian man, a man who gives style to his character, who harnesses the tension within for great things. But also in his later years, Nietzsche had become increasingly more dismissive of Spinoza as a man who promoted a sickly ideal, even if it was utilized by Goethe to bring Europe back to the pagan ideal, which was Nietzsche's highest. He writes in that same note that it is the highest ideal. But if we look at earlier Nietzsche, around the time of the early 1880s, which was the time when Human All Too Human was written, or around that time, Nietzsche wrote a letter to Overbeck in which he calls Spinoza his precursor, and he recognizes him as someone who anticipated his own thought in several respects, and who also importantly shared the sentiment of delivering man from the dismal workshop of the bad conscience, the mutilation of the soul that occurs when Christian morality imposes guilt upon the psyche. And even as late as the Genealogy of Morals, in a passage that is not entirely positive, Nietzsche, nevertheless, recognizes this fact of Spinoza, this great importance to Spinoza. We might turn to that particularly informative passage from the Twilight of Idols. This is in Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, number 49, entitled simply Goethe, in which Nietzsche writes, quote, "No mere German, but a European event, a magnificent attempt to overcome the 18th century by means of a return to nature, by means of an ascent to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-overcoming on the part of the century in question. He bore the strongest instincts of this century in his breast, its sentimentality and idolatry of nature, its anti-historic, idealistic, unreal, and revolutionary spirit. The latter is only a form of the unreal. He enlisted history, natural science, antiquity, as well as Spinoza, and above all, practical activity in his service. He drew a host of very definite horizons around him. Far from liberating himself from life, he plunged right into it. He did not give in. He took as much as he could on his shoulders and into his heart. That to which he aspired was totality. He was opposed to the sundering of reason, sensuality, feeling, and will, as preached with most repulsive scholasticism by Kant, the antipodes of Goethe. He disciplined himself into a harmonious whole. He created himself." End quote. So Goethe's task is to reconcile reason and sensuality, feeling and will. Spinoza walks a very different road. He sets as his enemy certain inner emotional states, the sad passions, and his ethical task is the conquest of these feelings. Spinoza is not a Stoic, nor is he a Christian. He doesn't do this to establish an inner psychodrama that heightens one's sense of guilt. We could say he actually acts from the opposite tendency. He acts with the aim of dissolving this guilt into the blameless totality of divine nature. But nevertheless, by making his enemy certain inner emotional states, he does represent that tendency in Western thought, particularly within rationalism, towards that separation. Both men say yes to life, but Spinoza sees the apotheosis of that trusting fatalism as the acceptance of all things and a detachment from the outcome, detachment from hope, hope for worldly success, detachment from fear of worldly loss. Whereas for Goethe, the trusting fatalism is rather the acceptance even of one's passionate striving, even of one's involvement with the struggle for worldly attainment, and thus an involvement with hope, an involvement with fear, an involvement with love and with loss. And so it's too reductive to say that Goethe is the romantic and Spinoza is the rationalist, as it might usually be said. In fact, both of them seek a kind of totality. Spinoza attempts to integrate all existence, all of its unity and disunity, into a harmonious whole, to tell us that all the ways in which we might see some sort of conflict or disunity is in fact part of a greater harmony. And he does so within the realm of thought as a philosopher. Whereas Goethe attempts to do the same, seeking the whole, but he doesn't do it within thought, because he's not, strictly speaking, a philosopher. Goethe attempts to integrate the scientific and the irrational in the domain of life by being both a scientist and a poet. He integrates the unity and disunity by being many things at once and at the same time one great thing. Spinoza seeks unity within the domain of thought. Goethe attempts this in the way he lives his entire life. Plato and Rousseau. The pairing of Plato and Rousseau is once again rather easy to grasp, in my opinion. Once again, we have a comparison between an ancient and a modern, and in this case, both men are idealists, but they idealize in two opposite directions. In the case of Plato, who lived in the 3rd century BC, The ideal is achieved by civilization, by the state and its education of the people to virtue. Plato is a supporter of the tutelary style of government. For Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, the ideal is achieved in the state of nature. In the Rousseauian view, the so-called progress of civilization has only served to take us away from the ideal state of affairs for mankind that existed prior to civilization, prior to knowledge, technology, ethical demands, political organization. Plato was the student of Socrates, and it is notable that Nietzsche selected him instead of Socrates to stand for this particular possibility of life. As to why this is, Nietzsche sees Plato as distinct from Socrates, insofar as Plato integrates the Socratic philosophy with a number of other philosophies from other figures such as Parmenides, Pythagoras, and so on. Nietzsche wrote in an 1875 fragment that Plato wished to think everything through to the end and to be the redeemer of Hellenic philosophy. Unlike Socrates, who wandered the streets as a dialectician, questioning the Athenian nobles and poets and craftsmen, interrogating them on the reasons for their values and beliefs, Plato instead is a builder. He's a systematizer. He founds the academy. He does not merely call into question existing beliefs, but presents a vision of the ideal society. And even though the words in Plato's Republic are attributed to Socrates, the life of Plato attests to his political ambitions, which seem to be entirely absent from the life of Socrates. It is as if Plato wishes to impose in physical reality that which for Socrates was an ideal conjured in the process of dialogue. Socrates puts forward his vision of the ideal state as part of an ethical project to instruct men as to how to order their souls. The ideal state is a mirror, it's a reflection of that ideal ordering of the soul. But for Plato, the ideal republic is something that can and should be realized in reality. 3 times he attempts to establish a state according to his own philosophical rule in Sicily. Nietzsche writes about this in Daybreak, quote, "It was in this state, and with its assistance, that Plato thought he could do for the Greeks what Mohammed did for the Arabs several centuries later, establishing both minor and more important customs, and especially regulating the daily life of every man. His ideas were quite practicable, just as certainly as those of Mohammed were practicable. For even much more incredible ideas, those of Christianity, proved themselves to be practicable. A few hazards less and a few hazards more, and then the world would have witnessed the Platonization of Southern Europe. And if we suppose that this state of things had continued to our own days, we should probably be worshipping Plato now as the good principle. But he was unsuccessful, and so his traditional character remains that of a dreamer and a utopian." End quote. So that would be the basis for my interpretation as to why Plato is chosen here and not Socrates in this pairing, which depends just as much on Rousseau as the other side of the same coin as it does on Plato. This is because if we consider, again, Socrates just as a counterfactual, Socratic philosophy is eminently practical. Nietzsche argues this in his pre-Platonic lectures. Socrates is concerned with using reason to determine right action, almost solely concerned with this, and promises that through virtue alone, one can live a happy life. Such a project doesn't require the restructuring of all society, even if the practice of virtue might demand one's advocacy for a certain type of state. One can find happiness in the meanwhile simply through virtuous living. But his student Plato, on the other hand, as Nietzsche argues, is a dreamer and a utopian. The idealism of Plato does not end with the world of Platonic ideas. In Plato's philosophy, we find an idealism which is quite a bit broader than that. The ideas, the forms, this is an assertion of an intelligible world of concepts as the most real thing. But Plato is quite literally a political idealist. He believes that the virtue or vice of those around you can affect your own capacity to behave virtuously, which is something that Socrates argues over the course of his dialogues. And so a natural consequence of that is in order to foster virtue, one must in fact change society. And that is the basis of Plato's belief in the tutelary government, that it is the role of the state, or ought to be the role of the state, to regulate the behavior of its members, even their daily customs and habits, to educate them to virtue. This is premised on the notion people are not inherently virtuous. It's not as if mankind is inherently vicious or evil either. It is simply the old wisdom of one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, Bias of Priene, that still holds true for Plato. Most men are bad. An individual who is governed by his reason and not by his passions is a very rare type. Only the most extraordinary man can place reason into its proper place as the governor of his psyche, and therefore use reason to subdue, tyrannize over the passions. For the rest of us, a tutelary state is needed in order to subdue and tyrannize all of us, passionate people. That's Plato's association of the common person, the great majority of human beings, with the passions or the impulses, because that is how they behave. So the ideal state ought to be governed by the most reasonable of men, in other words, by the philosopher. And so the formula, as we find it in Plato's Republic, is, quote, "There will be no end to the troubles of states, or of humanity itself, till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands." End quote. Plato's political philosophy is thus intimately bound up with the project of education. Those who hold political power must be philosophically educated, such that they can then bring about the philosophical education of others in the future. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, writing in the 1700s, after millennia of complex civilization, the tutelary state appears as a failure. Instead of virtue as the creation of the political, Rousseau sees virtue as something inherent within mankind, something that naturally occurs as long as man lives within the state of nature. In that state, man has a natural pity, a natural compassion. All are free from want because a man can acquire everything he needs in order to survive with his own 2 hands. The polity does actually the opposite of educating us to virtue. Instead, it educates us in the ways of vice. Rousseau begins his philosophical career by writing an essay in response to a prompt put forward by the Academy of Dijon. The question, have the arts and sciences improved the condition of human beings, or have they worsened it? And Rousseau took up for the unpopular position, especially in those days, in the thick of the Enlightenment, that the arts and sciences had worsened the condition of mankind. All of the new technology, both social and scientific, had done nothing to improve upon mankind's situation as we had once had it as a free animal within the state of nature. Rousseau's explanation for why mankind had proceeded down this road of civilization, in spite of the fact that it was against our best interests, was that man had insensibly followed the pleasure principle, seeking to liberate himself from want and to acquire for himself luxuries. But as we all know, those bounties were never shared equally. The acquisition of new technologies, particularly new technologies of warfare, have always led to prosperity for some and then oppression and exploitation for others. With every such technological advancement, life became more secure, perhaps, but less free, more abundant, perhaps, but less equal. And so Rousseau writes, quote, "As the strongest regarded their might, and the most wretched regarded their need, as giving them a kind of right to the possessions of others, equivalent, according to them, to the right of property, the elimination of equality was followed by the most terrible disorder, the usurpations of the rich, the brigandage of the poor, and the unbridled passions of everyone, stifling natural pity, and the as yet feeble voice of justice made men greedy, ambitious, and bad." End quote. The original sin, so to speak, of civilization was the divvying up of the earth into separate plots of land, the division of territory into private property. The rulers of society, far from being philosopher kings, who educated their lesser counterparts into becoming virtuous and happy, instead merely tyrannized over them and placed the majority of mankind into a state of abject deprivation that Rousseau argues was unknown in the state of nature. In other words, there are no destitute homeless people among the tribes that still live as hunter-gatherers. All of them are part of a kin group. They live off of the bounty of nature, and they naturally have a tendency for teamwork and cooperation. But what increasingly complex civilization has done is make some far better off than they ever could have been in the state of nature, and made the vast majority enslaved to political domination and subject to these property relationships that keep them in poverty over many generations. Rousseau writes in his Discourse on Inequality, quote, "The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, 'Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one.'" End quote. So, the significance of this pairing. First of all, we should note, again, that Nietzsche writes negatively about both figures. Nietzsche hates Plato's style. He says that Plato is boring. He says that his writing gets bogged down in wire-drawn, contrived dialogues. And he says that his suspicion of Plato is fundamental. Plato not only enacted this catastrophic slander of the senses, which is found in his Allegory of the Cave, but he also poisons the Greek mind with his political idealism, which is the main aspect of Plato that Nietzsche intends to bring up here by pairing him with Rousseau. And meanwhile, Nietzsche says of the Rousseauian perspective in Human All Too Human, quote, "Crush the damn thing. Écraser l'infâme," in French. So Rousseau's project is a monstrous distortion from Nietzsche's perspective. It's a romantic idealization of nature that, above all, does not match reality. It only appeals to those who find themselves alienated from nature, who feel themselves crushed under the weight of caste and badly educated by society's priests, and it eventually leads to the absolute bloodbath of the French Revolution. What is shared in Nietzsche's criticism of both is that both flee from reality. Rousseau flees from the reality of the state of nature. His return to nature is a return to a false conception of what that state of nature really was. In contrast, Nietzsche writes that Plato is also a coward before the face of reality, insofar as he idealizes the state. He prefers to imagine how human beings ought to behave, how they ought to organize themselves, who ought to be in charge, what values and motivations ought to govern human affairs. But Plato doesn't deal with the practical reality of how human beings actually are. He doesn't reckon with the fact that the hierarchical order that rules over human beings is not based on rationality. The state will never be ruled by philosophers so long as truth requires power, at least in order to be relevant. But to set all of that criticism aside then, why does Nietzsche include these two voices, these two types, among these 8 great minds that Nietzsche permits the right, he says, to pass judgment on himself and on one another? Why, when he disparages both of them, are they included? I would argue that it is because both are critics of the status quo. Both men search for something beyond the accepted political reality of their time. They do not simply affirm the values of their time and place, they set themselves in opposition to it, albeit in favor of an ideal, in one case an ideal that would be realized in a potential future, or in the other case an ideal that existed in a bygone idyllic past. Both make their enemy the values of their contemporaries. As a critic himself, we can see how Nietzsche might take some inspiration from this. In their opposition to their respective status quos, we see who they both are. Rousseau sees the redemption in Holy Mother Nature from the very fact that he is not a Greek. Those Hellenic Greeks who hailed from that early time in civilization saw nature as numinous and yet dangerous. The polis, the city, this is the proper environment for mankind, to the mind of an ancient Greek. They didn't romanticize nature, they were scared of nature, to put it bluntly. For Rousseau, the political reality is quite different. He lives in an advancing mercantile society on the verge of industrial capitalism. Nature is something that he finds very far from the human condition, and so romanticizing it is a way of trying to escape from that inevitable progressive logic of modernity. And so Plato sets his sights on perfecting the polis, because in his day the problems are, there are these democratic revolutions and tyrants taking power. The whole political project is called into question by the irrationality of the mob, and yet the political project for the ancient Greek is the redemption from violent, savage, unruly nature. And so Plato wishes to see how can we perfect this political process. For Rousseau, that promise of the whole project of civilization has already revealed itself to be empty and hollow. But there's a very interesting comment that Nietzsche makes about Plato's attempt to perfect the polis in his essay, The Greek State, in a paragraph that addresses Plato's Republic. Quote, "The proper aim of the state, the Olympian existence and ever-renewed procreation and preparation of the genius, compared with which all other things are only tools, expedients, and factors towards realization, is here discovered with a poetic intuition and painted with firmness. Plato saw through the awfully devastated Herma of the then existing state life, and perceived even then something divine in its interior. He believed that one might be able to take this divine image, and that the grim and barbarically distorted outside and shell did not belong to the essence of the state. The whole fervor and sublimity of his political passion threw itself upon this belief, upon that desire, and in the flames of this fire he perished. That in his perfect state he did not place at the head the genius in its general meaning, but only the genius of wisdom and knowledge, that he altogether excluded the inspired artist from his state, that was a rigid consequence of the Socratean judgment on art, which Plato, struggling against himself, had made his own." End quote. It must be said that Rousseau did not actually advocate for a return to the state of nature. His prescriptions instead involve adopting a kind of communal process of deliberation, in which all the members of a community come together in order to discern the general will, the interest of the entire community, which supersedes all individual wills. This will emerge in the course of sincere and open discourse among all who have a purchase in the community. By these means of achieving political equality for all involved, economic and social equality will eventually follow. But the point is crystal clear in Rousseau's writings. The development of the state and of complex civilization has been a deterioration, a long error, rather than progress. Rousseau's discovery of the general will is his attempt to find a path back to this imagined natural equality while remaining within the modern state of affairs that we cannot just undo. Plato is not aimed at equality, however, but at hierarchy, and Nietzsche clearly respects Plato's commitment to the order of rank. At least during the period in which he writes the Greek state, we can see that clearly, even if he sees the elevation of the theoretician to the position of the ruler of society to be a Socratean mistake. The philosopher-ruler becomes a sort of technocratic manager of society in the Platonic view. And so the ideal vision of society in both men is opposed, not just in that one sees it in the past and the other sees it in the future, or one sees it in nature and the other in civilization, but also in the fact that Rousseau sees it, the basis of his ideal society, in a will distributed throughout the community, which could establish a more equal society, whereas Plato sees the basis of his ideal society imparted from the top down. These two idealistic views of civilization are eternally valuable, eternally lively, because, as we see today, they continually exercise a consequential force on our political discourse. For whatever nuanced theories the various political philosophers come up with, the underlying spirit of reform and revolution usually comes as one of these two archetypal varieties: the primitivist or the technocrat, the anarchist or the central planner, the return to nature or the perfection of the state, and man as essentially good when left to his own devices, or man as in need of instruction and regulation. In every political debate up to this very day, one can often find both of these voices declaring themselves for either side, and oftentimes declaring themselves in equal measures on both sides. We now come to the final pair, Pascal and Schopenhauer. And before I analyze that pairing, I think this is a good opportunity to note something. One could just as easily have paired, say, Pascal and Montaigne. Pascal is a critic of reason, just as Montaigne is, so they have that similarity, but he reviles Montaigne's skepticism. He saw it as the root of a kind of a blasé, indifferent perspective on life that had become common among the socialites of his time. Or we could pair, as another possibility, Pascal and Spinoza. These are two men who are intoxicated with God, but Spinoza constructs a worldview that's premised on sort of like the imminence of one's communion with God at all times, and so the imminence of a kind of universalist redemption. Whereas Pascal thinks it's absolutely essential for one's salvation that they make a conscious commitment to seek God, from whom we are alienated, and that we must live a life of contrition, and that there is free will, and that there are differences between the different faiths and different ways of life. He feels this very strongly. So the fact that there are other comparisons that could be drawn if the pairings were arranged differently indicates to me these pairings have to be seen as intentional, and that Nietzsche therefore made a conscious choice not to counterpose, say, Montaigne and Pascal, which would be a contrast that elucidates little more than that one man doubts and the other man believes. Instead, in contrasting Montaigne and Epicurus, he gives us a far more subtle comparison. He puts a man who doubts but has faith in relationship to a man who has a materialistic reason, a rational ethical conviction, but hedges his bets with piety. That, to me, is a far more interesting comparison, a far more nuanced comparison than the more typical contrast of the religious man with the scientific positivist. And likewise here, it would be too simple to say that in Pascal and Schopenhauer, we merely have the contrast between a believer and an atheist. Blaise Pascal's life story is not the story of a man who finds faith in Christianity and then finds happiness and peace of the soul by that same token. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Pascal's spiritual life is characterized by a continuous struggle, a struggle with himself, a struggle against his depressive and anxious inclinations and thought. In fact, Pascal says that he sees much of Montaigne's doubting spirit within himself. His life is a sort of struggle against that Montaigneist doubt. He accordingly believed that perfect clarity, perfect intellectual clarity when it came to the existential questions, simply did not characterize the human condition because God could not give man perfect clarity. His reasoning for this is that perfect clarity would harm man's ability to exercise his free will. Pascal lived from 1623 to 1662, and he was a Catholic during the time of the Reformation. The answer within the Church to the Reformation was the Jesuit order. Pascal's sect, the Jansenists, were opposed to the Jesuit order based on their ends justify the means thinking that characterized Jesuit casuistry. Pascal sought to get back to the original Christianity, to rediscover the spirit of apostolic Christianity that characterized the first century. After an intense religious experience, Pascal became a devout Christian, and he left behind a number of writings in defense of Christianity before his all-too-early death. He is most famous for his theological argument known as the wager, It is premised on the idea that one must make a decision in this life in ignorance of the absolute truth, in absentia of that perfect intellectual clarity. One has to nevertheless make a decision whether to live as though God exists or live as though God does not exist. Either God exists or he doesn't. There's no middle ground or third possibility, and reason cannot help us in determining which one of these two options is the better one. Ultimately, one's faith has to be established in the form of a bet, a chance that one must take to wager everything one has on the possibility that there is a God and there is a chance of redemption, and that there is a possibility of regaining that communion with God. For Pascal, this mortal life is demonstrably terrible. And if this existence were all that there is, our situation would be like that of a mass of chained, helpless people who would witness day after day as some of their number were mercilessly butchered, and know that it was only a matter of time until this awful fate were visited upon them as well. The instability of existence, the fact that we perceive all that we know and love slipping away at every moment, that's what makes the human condition so manifestly terrible in the eyes of Pascal. His faith is not of the serene variety, but is rather the faith of a perpetually fearful and anxious man, trembling in the face of the void, desperate to hold on to his precious hope for another world. Quote, "The immortality of the soul is a matter which is of so great consequence to us, and which touches us so profoundly, that we must have lost all feeling to be indifferent as to knowing what it is. All our actions and thoughts must take such different courses, according as there are or are not eternal joys to hope for, that it is impossible to take one step with sense and judgment, unless we regulate our course by our view of this point, which ought to be our ultimate end." End quote. It's worth noting the ways in which Pascal and Schopenhauer therefore agree with one another, and agree quite profoundly. Schopenhauer would absolutely co-sign on the statement that life is terrible. Arthur Schopenhauer lived from 1788 to 1860. He is one of the greatest influences on Nietzsche, and he's known as a pessimist. That title could also be affixed to Pascal if he weren't to be classed among the Christian philosophers. But again, Schopenhauer's view of life is quite similar to that of Pascal. Pleasure, happiness, contentment, none of these things last. Life itself does not last. The individual manifestations of the will arise, they exist for a while in a state of desiring and suffering, and then pass away. Perhaps even worse than Pascal's dismal vision of life, however, is Schopenhauer's Buddhistic assertion that our death does not even stop this state of suffering. The will is all that there is to Schopenhauer, this undivided, ceaseless, blind, striving will, of which we are all just the individual manifestations of it, and our death does not stop the will from continuing to manifest itself. Our death is just a phenomenal event, a transitory event within this transitory world. And since all you are is part of this undivided blind willing that characterizes reality, you will continue to exist fundamentally as a part of that will. In effect, Schopenhauer creates the Buddhist notion of samsara within Western philosophy, that you will continue incarnating in this cycle of suffering even after your physical death, so long as you remain attached to the world and the things of the world, attached to yourself and your self-preservation. The only way out of this circle of life and death is to turn the power of the will against itself and use the will to negate the will to life. Schopenhauer writes in the essay on the suffering of the world, quote, "If you imagine, insofar as it is approximately possible, the sum total of distress, pain, and suffering of every kind which the sun shines upon in its course, you will have to admit it would have been much better if the sun had been able to call up the phenomenon of life as little on earth as on the moon, and if here as there the surface were still in a crystalline condition. You can look upon our life as an episode unprofitably disturbing the blessed calm of nothingness. In any case, even he who has found life tolerably bearable will, the longer he lives, feel the more clearly that on the whole it is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. If two men who were friends in their youth meet in old age, after a lapse of an entire generation, the principal feeling, the sight of one another, linked as it is with the recollections of early years, will arouse in both, will be one of total disappointment with the whole of life, which once lay so fair before them in the rosy dawn of youth, promised so much, and performed so little." End quote. For Schopenhauer, the blessed calm of nothingness, true death, true liberation from our existence as willing beings, is the secret aim of all religions, all spiritual traditions. What we call holy, what we call heaven, what we call nirvana or moksha, whatever terminology we use according to the spiritual tradition, this is really just a mythologized understanding of the negation of the will, and thus the negation of the world by that same token. The void is the real goal of spirituality. All of these religions speak of repose, of rest, of the Sabbath of Sabbaths, eternal peace. Schopenhauer's allegation is that the state of peace of the soul is only really possible in nothingness, because true repose would imply no want, which means no desire, which means no being. To Schopenhauer, the intelligible content of all the world is will. Will is what we find within ourselves as the intelligible core of what we are. Willing is desiring, and if willing doesn't exist, then the world as we know it does not exist either, for all is will. Schopenhauer's main difference from Pascal, then, is first and foremost, insofar as he doesn't believe that there's a personal God who can redeem or save us from this state of affairs. Perhaps the various religious traditions who have posited a God have been a kind of grasping of the human mind toward their own liberation, for which one becomes prepared by the moral and spiritual discipline of religion. But all the major religions attempt to negate the will, to negate the desires of the flesh, to deaden one's attachments to worldly things. And so in this way, the world's religions are quote-unquote true in that they aim at or approximate that ultimate value of negating the will. But Schopenhauer doesn't put much stock in the idea of God. Look at how Schopenhauer ranks the religious accounts of the condition of the world and of human existence. Quote, "Brahma is supposed to have created the world by a kind of fall into sin, or by an error, and has to atone for this sin or error by remaining in it himself until he has redeemed himself out of it. Very good. In Buddhism, the world arises as a consequence of an inexplicable clouding of the heavenly clarity of the blessed state of nirvana after a long period of quietude. Its origin is thus a kind of fatality, which is fundamentally to be understood in a moral sense. Subsequently, however, as a consequence of moral misdeeds, it gradually deteriorates physically too until it has assumed its present sad condition." Excellent. To the Greeks, the world and the gods were the work of an unfathomable necessity. That will do as a provisional explanation. Ahura Mazda is continually at war with Ahriman. That is worth considering. But that a god like Jehovah should create this world of want and misery, capriciously and voluntarily, and then go so far as to applaud himself for it, saying it is all very good, that is quite unacceptable. End quote. And so Schopenhauer rejects this world, and he clearly sees the value of these various religious traditions in that they present a view of the world that is fundamentally negative in most of these cases, and the religious goal is liberating oneself from existence. But he also rejects God, and he says the Christian religious story is the worst one, which would have horrified Pascal. The fact that Schopenhauer finds his salvation in nothingness. Pascal's writings are laced with this longing for life, for eternal life, a longing for some ataraxy and this great tension of the soul that he feels. And while Schopenhauer is aimed at the same kind of thing, Pascal thinks human beings of their own accord are never going to achieve this, using their will to negate the will. That's a contradiction in terms. No, mankind needs a savior in order to lift him out of that state of inner dividedness. Pascal is a tortured soul also. His faith doesn't give him a sense of security. It actually heightens the stakes of the existential struggle. He is painfully aware of his status as a sinner. He doesn't take his own salvation for granted. The only way out of this impermanent world is the Christian world of moral judgment, which ends up creating a new source for Pascal's fear and anxiety. He writes in his Pensées, quote, "Every condition, and even the martyrs, have to fear according to Scripture. The greatest pain of purgatory is the uncertainty of judgment. Deus absconditus," end quote. In just the difference between their personalities, a really fruitful contrast. Schopenhauer is not the same type of tortured soul. Nietzsche does say that Schopenhauer is a man who's at war with his own desires and impulses, and that he construed this war into an explanation for the entire world. The entire point of life, of philosophy, of religion, is to subdue the instincts, let the intellect contemplate the world as it truly is. But he's not a weeping, trembling spirit. He's not cut from the same cloth as fellow pessimists like Cioran or Ligotti. If I might attempt to encapsulate the spirit of Schopenhauer in a way that I think that great pessimist would probably quite approve of, I would do it by bringing up the Buddha's teaching in the Pali Canon, in the Asu Sutra, that over the course of one's endless lifetimes in the cycle of samsara, one has cried enough tears to fill all the oceans already. The point of the passage is to recognize this, recognize all the strife and suffering one has already endured in their past incarnations, and to recognize then that what you have now in the form of a human life is rather precious. This is a sentiment shared in Schopenhauer's philosophy. A human life is valuable insofar as it affords you the opportunity to detach from your desires and reach nirvana. One shouldn't lament their human life. They should recognize the incredible opportunity and use it accordingly, because all of the lower beings in Buddhism don't have the ability to meditate and reach nirvana. Neither do the higher beings, the gods. The gods are too happy, the animals are too stupid, the sinners in hell are suffering too much. Human beings have the possibility of attaining to the middle path where they could finally liberate themselves. And so the whole tenor and the whole tone of Schopenhauer's philosophy is much more in line with that sort of Buddhistic middle way. Whereas in Pascal, we have that emotionally troubled believer for whom faith itself is also a struggle, who's terrified that the human condition is all there is. He perceives the human condition as so brutal in the absence of God. Whereas for Schopenhauer, who sees an equally brutal existence, we have this man who sort of embodies absolute non-willing, absolute intellect over the body's impulses, in spite of the fact that he believes we live within this atheistic, brutal concept of reality. Of all these four pairings, Pascal and Schopenhauer are probably the two to whom Nietzsche has the greatest debt, we might say. He probably spends the most time criticizing these two as well. Schopenhauer is formative for Nietzsche's entire philosophy, and it must be said that it's formative in the way that Nietzsche basically discovers his philosophy in some sense by rejecting Schopenhauer's pessimistic worldview, what he calls Schopenhauer's resignationism, his pessimism of weakness. Pascal, on the other hand, Nietzsche would consider Pascal a genius, as he was. He was a mathematical genius, a philosophical genius, a logical genius. And yet, he has this beautiful mind that is poisoned and corrupted by Christianity. Pascal is referenced over and over again in Daybreak, for example, almost as Nietzsche's model for the archetypal victim of the Christian worldview. He writes in a notebook from the late 1880s, quote, "One should never forgive Christianity for having destroyed such men as Pascal. One should never cease from combating just this in Christianity, its will to break precisely the strongest and noblest souls." End quote. So Nietzsche would count Pascal amongst those strongest, noblest souls, whereas with Schopenhauer, it is sort of an open question as to whether or not he would describe him that way. There is something energetic, something active and combative within the very spirit of Pascal that Schopenhauer seems to lack. Schopenhauer achieves this state of self-tyranny on the basis of an intellectual understanding of reality. And, he pens his philosophical magnum opus when he's 26 years old, and then he never changes his philosophy for the rest of his life. Schopenhauer figures it all out in World as Will and Representation, and then the matter is settled. Philosophy is settled, life is settled, religion is settled, morality is settled. Schopenhauer has this invariable stance toward reality that he sets into. Pascal is not the same kind of person, really. He's a great genius who becomes botched, which is a very common occurrence, actually. Nietzsche thinks, again, I've used this example many times, but it's such a great line. The ordinary fate of the genius, of the extraordinary person, is to be botched. What does that mean? Well, Nietzsche gives the example of a Raphael without hands. So often one's life circumstances or something, in this case, Christianity is that very calamity. It's something that he came into contact with, which greatly influenced his mind, and then completely botched him. He did not turn out well. Pascal is a kind of restless spirit, a man with his eye turned towards the beyond, always looking over the horizon, we might say. And because Christianity is the mental software that he ends up running, all of these qualities, these active and perhaps genius qualities, become turned towards, again, self-torture, self-destruction. His whole life is stress and struggle. And Nietzsche suspects that Pascal burns himself out, that literally, physiologically, by worrying so much about the eternal soul's salvation all the time, Pascal shortens his own life. He's another such figure who dies an untimely death, like Spinoza, whereas Schopenhauer lives to old age. In aphorism number 481 of Daybreak, we get another really interesting comparison. And pretty much every other person on this list appears in this aphorism. There are a couple who are excluded. We'll just read it and then talk about it because it's incredibly helpful for understanding how Nietzsche thinks about these figures. Quote, if we compare Kant and Schopenhauer with Plato, Spinoza, Pascal, Rousseau, and Goethe, with reference to their souls and not their intellects, we shall see that the two first-named thinkers are at a disadvantage. Their thoughts do not constitute a passionate history of their souls. We are not led to expect in them romance, crises, catastrophes, or death struggles. Their thinking is not at the same time the involuntary biography of a soul, but in the case of Kant merely of a head, and in the case of Schopenhauer, again, merely the description and reflection of a character, the invariable, and the pleasure which this reflection causes, that is to say, the pleasure of meeting with an intellect of the first order. End quote. There's a contrast between Schopenhauer and Pascal, who are the two thinkers of this pairing we're considering, but on both sides of the scale, Nietzsche also places other figures. On the side with Schopenhauer, he places Kant, and on the side with Pascal, pretty much every other person on this list. He doesn't mention Epicurus and Montaigne. I think Montaigne would for sure be on the same side as Plato, Spinoza, Pascal, Rousseau, and Goethe. Epicurus, I am not so sure. I will leave that up for all of you to reflect on. I think it's entirely possible he could end up in the Kant and Schopenhauer camp, but I think it's also possible you could make an argument he could be on the other side as well. But in any case, the essential difference between Schopenhauer, and for that matter Kant, and the majority of all the other figures that Nietzsche encounters here in the underworld, including Pascal, is that Schopenhauer's philosophy does not convey a passionate history of his own soul. Pascal's philosophy does. So Schopenhauer, along with Kant, is a creature of that cold German intellect, let loose as the sole author of one's philosophy. Even with a geometrical mind, such as Spinoza, Nietzsche classes his philosophy as the confession of a passionate living soul. Spinoza is still the God-intoxicated man, even as geometrical as his thoughts are. Even with Plato, whom Nietzsche fundamentally mistrusts, and even with Rousseau, whom Nietzsche frankly hates, we find a confession of one's soul. Schopenhauer, who is at the same time Nietzsche's greatest teacher, his mentor, and one of the greatest objects of his criticism, is the reflection of an invariable character, this iron will to negate desire, a conceptual, ethical, ascetic value realized in a living being as a kind of necessity. The dichotomy between Schopenhauer and Pascal is therefore best expressed in this way. Pascal's salvation is found in the struggle to hold on to faith for eternal life above all earthly concerns, above all logic, above all blasé detachment. And Schopenhauer's salvation is found in the iron will to negate desire. Pascal is a sort of heightened moral psychodrama of Christianity, contained within one person, the burning desire for salvation in the sick soul, the philosopher who condemns reason, and the sinner crying out for redemption, all within one person. Schopenhauer is the Western Buddhist, a philosophical priest who sees his religion as the fulfillment of all religion, all philosophy, and he sees all striving and all desire as the road to hell. But perhaps we have not said enough on what unites the two thinkers, their common war on happiness. Like Epicurus, Schopenhauer conceives of happiness as a negative. The way that we normally conceive of happiness is as a state with a positive content. But Schopenhauer says that all we can hope for is the relief of suffering, that this is truly what we mean when we talk about happiness. The difference between those two is, of course, that Epicurus thinks we can remove enough of those limits on happiness to be happy in life, whereas Schopenhauer says a happy life is impossible. Pascal, similarly, denounces the whole cornucopia of worldly pleasures, stakes everything on a life of humility and contrition. Both men are seized by this inner dictate that they have to reject the sedate view of happiness. They have to reject the fulfillment that the naive seek after. And even the more subtle version of happiness, preached by the ancients, eudaimonia, found in the minds of philosophers such as Socrates, earthly happiness of the kind that Epicurus may have thought possible, this is not on the agenda for either man. And this is all the more interesting when we consider that finding earthly happiness could be considered to be Nietzsche's raison d'etre, to say yes to the joys of life, and consequently to affirm life even in its suffering, to love our fate, and to learn to laugh and dance on our way to accepting our fate. And so given this, and given the fact that Nietzsche's comments on both Pascal and Schopenhauer tend to be very negative, as we've already mentioned, one might wonder, again, why are these two figures included here? Well, the deep significance of the two is something that Nietzsche recognizes and sees as a part of himself. He writes in an unpublished note, quote, "I have the contempt of Pascal and the curse of Schopenhauer on me. And can anyone be more affectionately inclined toward them than myself? But admittedly with that affection which remains frank, in order to remain a friend, and not become a lover and fool." End quote. The nature of Nietzsche's affection for Pascal and Schopenhauer, and indeed for all of these figures, it's found in seeing them clearly, seeing eye to eye with them, as he says in the passage. His affection for all eight is manifest in the fact that he gives them the respect of seeing them for who and what they are. He doesn't try to see them as infallible, he doesn't worship any of them, and he doesn't just dismiss them or you reject them wholeheartedly. These eight figures, these four pairs of monumental souls whom Nietzsche meets in the underworld, these are the great minds whose words seem to Nietzsche as though they're eternally lively, they're eternally alive even now, even after having departed the world for hundreds or thousands of years. And to commune with them, Nietzsche says he has given his life's blood. And what does that mean? His life's energy, his time and effort. He has invested so much, sacrificed so much of his time to the task of coming to an understanding, of seeing eye to eye with these eight. And at the end of our exegesis here, I think we can all see how it would be foolish to attempt to group these figures in some sort of neat categorization scheme where half of them are Apollinian and half are Dionysian, half are yes-saying, half are no-saying. I think we can all see how that doesn't work. These pairings are incredibly contextual. They're intentional in terms of the relations that Nietzsche establishes, seen in the fact that he could have paired them differently, but he chose to pair them in a specific way, and I think we're supposed to look at each specific pairing and glean something specific from each one. Plato could represent a dozen things if invoked as a representation. If he just mentioned them not in pairs and mentioned them individual, and he said, Plato is one of my predecessors, that could mean many different things. But when he's placed in contrast with Rousseau, that context makes it perfectly clear what Nietzsche is attempting to invoke with Plato. Plato as the idealist of civilization. It's the same with Epicurus and Montaigne. That makes primary the question of whether reason can give us certainty in regard to ethical action or in regard to the existential condition of human beings. In the case of Goethe and Spinoza, one realizes immediately the relevant aspect of both is their approach to life and knowledge. And in the case of Pascal and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche centers, we might say, pessimism, how it could be a curse on life or a quest for something beyond it, how it could botch and ruin someone, turn them into a hysteric, depressive person, or lead them into a sort of serene, invariable resignation to one's fate. So, what are we to say about this passage, Journey to Hades, to sum it up? What meaning can we take from the entire thing in light of all of Nietzsche's specific remarks about these 8 figures found throughout his entire career? And I think above all, what we should focus on here is the method. We could look at Nietzsche himself in the same way as these 8 figures that Nietzsche converses with, locks eyes with, allows the right of judgment. This is, in some sense, as I hope you have all realized by now, the entire point of the Nietzsche podcast. The point is not to preach Nietzsche's ideas as truths, to romanticize Nietzsche as a hero, to suggest that Nietzschean philosophy ought to be elevated above all other forms of philosophy. The point is to become acquainted with Nietzsche as another such possibility for life. And Nietzsche is an extraordinary possibility for life. Nietzsche is a decadent modern philosopher who directs his attacks, his criticisms against decadence, against modernity, and against philosophy itself. Nietzsche is a sick man who elevates the value of health. Nietzsche attacks the philosophers as idealistic priests, and then meanwhile writes a book in the style of the Bible and makes prophetic statements and provides an idealistic vision for mankind, albeit he authors an ideal of mankind as anti-idealistic, a vision of a new mankind that has left behind the need for such Platonic thinking, or a mankind that has liberated itself from guilt and resentment. But we can't help but notice Nietzsche articulates these ideas in the same fashion as the dialecticians that he criticizes, as the self-overcoming of old, sick values. And above all, he's the one who counterposes the Greek values against our modern values as a form of critique, in order to raise the possibility into our minds of a way of life that truly and absolutely affirms life and affirms the world, and that blesses the struggles of life without recourse to another one. That image, that total picture of who Nietzsche is, that voice, that perspective, that is valuable. But I should hope that what any true Nietzschean would then do is to then place Nietzsche himself as one among these lively spirits in the underworld. Nietzsche is a type whose thoughts, whose words are so alive, even in death, that sometimes the average living person pales in comparison to him. That's why we all love Nietzsche. And so he should be placed among other such monumental souls, placed into dialogue, into comparison and contrast with them. And he can become one of those teachers that we give the right of judgment to. Not because we're going to blindly follow Nietzsche's ideas, but because it's continually valuable to ask ourselves, what would Nietzsche say about that? And then in contrast, you could ask, how would that compare with, say, Schopenhauer's judgment, or with Hegel's judgment, or with Kant's judgment, or with Marx's judgment, or with Cioran's judgment, or Heidegger's? That we could place Nietzsche into those same sorts of contrasting pairs and learn something really valuable and fascinating that can have relevance for our own lives. It's that instruction in Nietzsche's method that we can all carry forward from this analysis and come up with our own 8 souls within our own personal underworld, or however many such souls you think you can hold together in your mind. If this podcast stands for anything, it is that. It's simply a case for Nietzsche to have a seat at that table. That's all for this week, everyone. The final episode of the season is coming up next. Hopefully, after our little visit, you can all find your way back up from the underworld, just as Pythagoras did. Do yourself a favor, though. Skip the pomegranates on your way out. Next time, we return to the world of the living. Please join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.